Well, warm welcome to everybody to the Non-Duality Roundtable with John Prendergast, Adyashanti, and Rupert Spira. I'm Jonathan Gustin. I'm the founder of Purpose Guides Institute, where we do three things. We have meditation gatherings, meditation teaching. We help people to find and embody their soul level purpose. And we train people to become guides, purpose guides themselves. So you might have wondered why these specific three non-dual teachers, and the answer is really simple. They are my three main living non-dual teachers. Next year, next May, when we do our second annual non-dual roundtable, I'll actually have to think about it, but this year was a complete no-brainer. And so I think for me, there's really at least two notable things I want to presence. One is that two of these teachers, Adya and Rupert, have never met before. And the second is that Adya, after I think 27 years of teaching, maybe a little more, is retiring next month. So at least for me, this feels like an auspicious gathering. And I want to warmly thank the three of you and welcome you. John, warm welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, Adya, warm welcome to you.
There we go. How's that?
Excellent.
All right.
Thanks for being with us, Adya.
It's so good to be here with and sharing this with you, Jonathan, and all of you. Yeah, that's going to be a nice plunge into the deep end, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And a warm welcome to you, Rupert.
Thank you, Jonathan. Lovely to be here with all of you.
Well, before I plunge in with the questions, I want to mix the roundtable discussion with little short, 3-4 minute experientials. So I've asked John to lead a very brief non-dual meditation.
Okay, good. I have my little bell. And I want to encourage everyone to sit comfortably, upright, feet flat on the floor, eyes closed or slightly open. And take several slow, deep breaths. And allowing your attention to naturally drop down and in. Feeling the weight of your body held. And relaxing into the sense of being held. There's no efforting. Nothing to change. And then a slight shift of attention to that which is holding. A sense of vast, spacious, loving awareness.
So we are both held on that which holds. And that distinction dissolves.
Hey, John, that was beautiful. Well, from the wordless or almost wordless to many, many words, I just again want to invite the three of you, when we speak to one another, if there's something that you disagree with or see something a little differently, I don't want this to just be a love fest. I'm hoping that actually the different flavors and perfumes that you each have can kind of push up against each other in a way that will benefit everybody who's listening. So with that in mind, here we go. Would you please offer your teaching on non-duality in a 30-second distilled gem? Let's start with Rupert, if you will.
Peace and quiet joy are the very nature of our being. And we share our being with everyone and everything. All that is necessary is to understand this, to feel this, and to lead a life to the best of our ability in a way that is consistent with and an expression of this felt understanding.
John.
None of us are who we think we are. Who and what we are is beyond imagination, beyond comprehension by the ordinary mind. And yet we are this non-separate, seamless reality that pervades everyone and everything. The realization of this is the greatest joy, the most beautiful discovery. And to embody and live this in our ordinary life is the open challenge and invitation to each of us.
Adya.
Just that's the essence of the teaching.
Same question, a little different. Please offer your, it's the E word. Please offer your teaching on enlightenment in a distilled 30-second gem. If you said the same thing, that's okay, but it's
Who are you
slightly
asking?
different.
Are you
We'll go in the
asking?
same order, just so we keep it fresh. Let's go with Rupert.
You could say that, one could say that enlightenment is simply the recognition of the nature of our being. The inherent emptiness of being is experienced as peace. The inherent fullness of being is experienced as happiness. And the shared nature of being is experienced as love.
John.
I would make a distinction between awakening and enlightenment, although these terms are used differently and can be quite slippery. For me, enlightenment is really an open-ended process of the body-mind being imbued and infused with the light of awareness, and the recognition of our essential nature on the level of the mind and the heart and the belly catalyzes and supports this process of opening and deepening. And there is a quality of illumination. I think, the word enlightenment implies light, and there is a luminosity that unfolds as the light of awareness imbues the body mind. And so I think that's an open-ended and profound process.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like you, John. It's a conceptual distinction, but I think it's also something in actual experience, the difference, even though it's on the same spectrum between awakening and enlightenment. I'm not the kind of person that tends to reify enlightenment, and make it into sort of a mythological state that nobody can ever attain. There's been a bit too much of that happening. But I do equate the enlightenment with the ability to embody what we realize. Now, where along this spectrum, right? Because there's no dividing strictly lines. It's a spectrum. Where along the spectrum that anybody would feel comfortable calling that enlightenment, I think that obviously differs from tradition, from teaching to teaching, even from teacher to teacher. But I think the awakening shows us our true nature, and it doesn't show us something different in a realization sense if it's authentic and deep than enlightenment. It's just, I think it's, to me, I use that term enlightenment more in the sense of our capacity to embody what we realize. And I also agree, John, that it's a life. It's an endless process. I don't see there's an end point to being able to embody what we realize, because realization is almost unlimited, and our body minds will always be reflecting that in a relative sense. In an absolute sense, all this is already happening, right? But also, we have these human lives. And everybody that's listening to this show, I imagine, knows the experience, whether it's an awakening experience or an insight. We all know the experience of having an insight that feels profound and real to us, maybe life-changing, who knows? But we all know the experience of having certain insights about our life and ourselves, and then faced with the prospect of what would that actually be like to live that little insight that I just had. So whether it's great or small, I think it's one of the beautiful challenges and opportunity of all this.
A couple of you mentioned the sort of spectrum, of enlightenment or awakening, depending on how you use the word. So I'm curious, do you see whether it's discrete or fluid stages, discovering realization? I'll just put out a few words: abiding, then living and expressing our realization. Are these semi-discrete things? Do you see a sort of a progression or stages in enlightenment? And now we can just sort of open it up. whoever wants to just go.
I think there are stages, but they're not predictably sequential. So often there's lots of exceptions to this rule. I'm an exception to this rule, but very often when people have their first kind of real glimpse, they often have the sense of themselves as being this sort of pure awareness. They often don't get the other part, which is awareness on all the objects in awareness. They don't experience that to sort of be a unified process often. Sometimes people do leap right into there, but I find often people get this awareness piece before they get the unity piece. And people can get the, what I call, or what the sort of root, where I think the separate self actually sort of somatically resides, sort of down in the belly. So we can see through self conceptually. We can see through and still not see through it emotionally. We can see through it conceptually, emotionally, and still not see it through the root. We can see it through the root, like I did. First opening I had was to the root, and still had confusions about other parts. So I do see these stages that I watch people go through, but they're just not. They often seem to follow a kind of predictable pattern, but there's always outliners that will prove any sort of sequential thing that I might say. I could come up with handfuls of people that didn't go that way, starting with myself, but often it goes from awareness, or presence, and later the unity piece comes in, and each of those pieces has its own sort of embodiment possibilities and challenges too, each part of our own realization. So that's probably where I would start with in response. I'd be interested to hear what anybody else has to say of on just that generalized subject.
Rupert, go ahead.
I like how you volunteered, Rupert.
Well
done, Jai.
Keep doing that, John.
Well, I would kind of echo what you said, so I want to hear what Rupert has to say first.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, as I think I very rarely, if ever, use the terms enlightenment or even awakening, because I think they make something that is incredibly simple, exotic. I don't think there is anything less exotic than recognizing the nature of being. The fact of simply being is everybody's most intimate, most well-known experience. But for almost all of us, our being is most of the time mixed up with the content of experience, mixed up with our thinking, our feeling, perceptions, actions, relationships, and so on. And this is expressed in common parlance. We all think and say all day long, I am tired, I'm traveling to work, I'm lonely, I'm excited, I'm listening to a conversation, I'm sitting on a chair, I'm cooking dinner, and so on. It's always I am, qualified temporarily by a feeling, a state, an action, a relationship, and so on. And the I am aspect of all experience is our being. And so-called enlightenment or awakening is simply to recognize the nature of being before it becomes entangled in and apparently qualified by the content of experience. And there is nothing exotic about that. It is just the simplest, the simple, most intimate experience there is. For most people, we get tastes or glimpses of this recognition of the nature of being, and then experience quickly comes in again, and we become entangled with experience. So for most of us, there is this back and forth process, lost in experience, back to the fact of simply being, lost in experience again, back to the fact of simply being. But each time we go back to simply being, experience loses its capacity to veil our being. And in this way, we just become progressively established in our being, and its innate peace and quiet joy, and in time its shared quality become more and more obvious.
It may be, it is ordinary, non-exotic, and yet the capacity for a human to get lost in experience is so pervasive, so strong. So it does seem that it is, for most people, although there are outliers, kind of a long process. It can be frustrating. It can feel like slow as molasses. It can fail to fully fruit in a person's lifetime. So given that potential trajectory, even though it's so simple and available, do you recommend it?
Recommend
the journey to the utter simplicity of being, given that for so many people, there are maybe millions of meditators, and possibly, I wouldn't know, a high percentage of them feel frustrated, stymied, stuck, and it could go on for decades.
So let's say you have the feeling, I feel stymied, I am stymied, or I am frustrated, or I am stuck. In all of these phrases, there is the I am stuck, I am frustrated, I am lonely. What does this I am refer to? It just refers to the fact of being. Although normally we emphasize the frustration and we neglect the I am. We emphasize the feeling of being stuck. We neglect the I am. We emphasize the fact that we're listening to a conversation, and we neglect the I am. But the I am is always shining there. Right now, everybody thinks or feels I'm listening to a conversation. It's probably, you don't want me to say this, Jonathan, but if you soften the focus of your attention from the content of our conversation and emphasize the feeling of being, right there, being is shining brightly in the midst of experience. It's just that we turn away from it, or more accurately, it loses itself in the content of experience and seems to acquire the qualities of experience. Our thoughts are agitated, so we feel I am agitated. Our feelings are sorrowful, so we feel I am sad. But the I am, in fact, it's like the screen behind the movie. It doesn't share the qualities of the movie, just like our being doesn't share the qualities of experience. It is inherently peaceful and inherently fulfilled, and all that's necessary is just to relax back into that, to taste that, to recognize that.
So I'd like to step in here if I could. So what you're describing, Rupert, is the accenting of awareness, the I am. And for some people, it's true. I mean, in principle, it's always here regardless of experience. However, for many people, that recognition, and I would agree with the definition of awakening as being recognition, is often very heavily veiled and obscured, to your point, Jonathan. And yes, if we feel stuck, we can ask who is stuck, or feel back into that background awareness, and that is always available. But as you know, I've worn several hats. One as a psychotherapist, and so I've worked a lot with the content of the psyche, as well as a spiritual teacher, pointing directly to awareness. And I find there's a kind of natural unfolding and movement of discovery between these realms, and simply pointing to kind of resting back as awareness for many people is not easily accessible, even if we can understand it in principle and touch it briefly, because of the density of conditioning. So I want to mark that point, but I also want to circle back a little bit to the original question in terms of this unfolding process, and if I may. And I do agree with you, Adya, that there's no particular sequence, and there are always outliers. And I think yours is probably that kind of opening, what you call the root or the hara, that lower center is probably the least usual. And then more common, but still less usual, is of the heart. But in my experience, both personally and the people that I've worked with, often it's a top-down process. And I'd be interested to hear if that's your guys' experience as well. But often it requires a real clarity of thought for the mind to see its limitations, and of ordinary thought, and for a distinction between awareness and thought, in order to have that opening of freedom from our story and from our self-image, which brings the essential quality of clarity and spaciousness. And I think when a lot of people speak of recognition or awakening, they use those kind of terms to articulate it and think that it's somehow complete, when in fact, really it's a first step. It's not, I agree, exotic. It is the most natural of openings, but there is a palpable sense of freedom and openness that's distinctive in that opening. So I don't want to diminish its significance either, but also it's part of a process that often, not always, feels like a descent from head to heart. And then the qualities of love and compassion and unity, as you were saying, Adya, come online, non-separateness. Like initially there's a sense of the infinity of the apparent observer, but still a finite known, still a subtle duality. And until it feels like that awake awareness opens in the heart area, there's not the sense of the real dissolution of duality. And yet it continues to deepen even further. So from clarity and love to the opening of the lower center, the hara or the subhara, there's a sense of profound stability, unshakable nature. And I find that this process of self-recognition just weaves back and forth in this way, in a very unique way for people. And it's very interesting, I find, to track that and to honor that, not to impose, it should be this way, but to actually recognize there is an unfolding, a natural unfolding of this awake awareness in each of us, and to trust that within ourselves, not to impose some outer structure or map, but really to deeply listen and honor this. And that means honoring our human conditioning too, honoring the veils that are there, being willing to be intimate with those and embrace those. And for me, that's the embrace of our humanity. This really brings it into the body, brings it down to ground, brings it into relationship. And this is what's so most important. This is what's being called for, I think, in terms of society and our relationship with the environment and the planet as well. Because otherwise, great to have that, a sense of spaciousness, but unless it really deeply imbues the body mind and radiates out, ground up and out, it lacks a potency, it lacks a creative power, I think. So anyway, I want to throw that into the conversation.
I think also what you're implying there, John, tell me if I'm wrong, but there's different qualities of awakening. We often talk about awakening as if it's all one monolithic experience, and at its root, if it's authentic, of course, we're seeing through the separate self, right? So but what I call like a head awakening is quite different from a root awakening. A root awakening is quite different from a heart awakening, although they share certain fundamental, you know, it's all the same thing that's being revealed, but it's almost like it's being revealed through the human embodied character, right? Because these things aren't just floating out here, they're actually right here. Even if they feel like they're out here, they're actually just right here. And so I think, you know, these different qualities of awakening, and each of those qualities puts different pressures on somebody. You know, like if we have an awakening of pure spacious awareness, and that's beautiful and extremely freeing, but that may or may not actually have any transformation at their emotional level, right? I mean, there will be emotion when you have the realization, even though the realization is much deeper than emotion, but that may not unlock someone's relational. In other words, we can be very awake in one dimension of being and quite asleep in another dimension of being. And I see this all the time. Someone can be very clear on pure awareness, but then they come to me and say, why does every relationship I have, why doesn't it work? Why can't I get it? I have this wonderful thing. Well, when we start to delve into it, there's a lot of emotional sort of not only confusion and conditioning, but also a kind of a lack of awakeness itself penetrating that dimension, because this dimension for most people is more guarded even than the intellectual dimension, not always. And the root dimension is sure as hell more guarded than either one of these. Because this is root, this is the fundamental. This is not seen through self, the emptiness of self. This is actually being emptiness of self, which is very, very, it's another distinction that's often not sort of made. We can have insights about certain things that are profound and life transformative without them penetrating. Again, back to that, our human. And again, this is just I don't think there's a fundamental objective, you know, perspective on this. This is the true and right perspective. This is just how it occurs here to me, right? I don't have a sense that it's supposed to occur this way, everybody else, or this context is relevant to everybody in the universe, but this is how it's presenting itself here, right? That makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Any response, Rupert?
I think I possibly, I know John and Adya, you know each other very well, and you're familiar with each other's language, and I'm not so familiar with John. I know you quite well, but I'm not so familiar with your teaching, and Adya even less so. And I see now from just this last 10 minutes of conversation that I think I use the words, to the extent that I use the words enlightenment or awakening at all, I use them in a narrower and perhaps more specific sense than you two do. So this is a matter of language, I think, more than understanding. If our lives were a book, the so-called enlightenment or awakening in my book, I don't mean the book for myself, but for everyone, it happens at the end of chapter 1. It's not perhaps chapter 2. It's not a big deal. It's most of the chapters. In fact, it's a book. I was going to say it had 12 chapters, but actually it's a book that never ends. So unlike you two, who I'm getting the sense that enlightenment is something that goes on deepening and progressing throughout the whole book. For me, it's something more specific. It happens at the end of chapter 1, possibly chapter 2. You recognize the nature of your being, what you are at the deepest level prior to experience. And then the rest of your life, the remaining chapters are spent integrating that understanding, both within oneself in one's feelings, but also outside oneself in one's actions and relationships. And that process, I absolutely agree with you both, is an endless process. I don't think, I mean, I hope it's endless. I can't imagine it ever coming to an end. So somebody expressed it beautifully once in religious terms. They said, when the journey to God comes to an end, the journey in God begins. This is a religious way of saying, once one has recognized the unlimited and inherently peaceful nature of one's being, then the journey in God, the journey of the endless, the never-ending journey of allowing this felt understanding to penetrate more and more deeply into every aspect of one's life, not just how one thinks and feels on the inside, but how one acts and relates on the outside. So I think in that sense, I agree with what John and Adya, you have said, although I perhaps use the word enlightenment or awakening more specifically than you two do.
Yeah, and I understand that, Rupert, like what that a little bit tighter of a definition, right? I'm a fan of tight definitions, although I'm not always, applying them. I look at it like, and it may be, I think a lot of this at the end of the day is kind of conceptual. Maybe it's not all conceptual. It's hard to say at this point. But my experience is it's kind of very paradoxical. So it's a little bit hard to state that my experience is that fundamental nature of being, which Rupert, you articulated so well on a number of occasions. So I don't really need to do that. But that wonderful recognition in that I would totally agree in that experience. There's the experience of really no more or no less. Reality isn't, more of reality or less of reality. And simultaneously with that, not just my sort of understanding on an insight level, but my experience of that is both the same and different as it ever was, right? In a sense, like when we're born, we're 100% human beings. There's nothing left out, right? Boom, we're a baby. We can't do much. We don't have much of our capacity unfolded or developed, whether it's cognitively or any other way. And yet there's no parent, I don't think, on the face of the earth that thinks their child is somehow less, right? Not complete necessarily. And yet, even though we're complete human beings when they're born, pardon me, this metaphor can break down in several different ways, but we're complete, but that completeness is unfolding itself throughout our lifetime, right? That potential. And I think even though the parallel isn't absolutely direct, like I said, it can break down in some areas, but I think we can have a realization of that fundamental nature of being that is never more or less. So in that sense, we recognize it or we don't, right? It's, but that, at least in my experience, that nature of being has a paradoxical nature. It's the same that it was the first moment that it was ever revealed. And I think I've experienced and see a lot more nuance about it than I did when I was 25 years old, right? That doesn't mean the being has changed or become more or less. It just means my capacity to delve into its nuance, even though I would also agree, Rupert, that it is, and in my language, I say, it's not sexy. Stop looking for sexy special things, because that gets us going down so many sort of cul-de-sacs. And yet that which is not particularly, that which is just fundamental, at least to me, it can continue to reveal, but it's revealing the same thing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I want to bring in another term here. One thing everybody shares, whether you're, overtly self-consciously spiritual, is the desire to be happy. So what is the relationship between happiness and whatever this word enlightenment, awakening points to?
I'll let somebody else
I'll-
take the floor.
I'll start because my response is so short and quick, and then I'll leave you to enlightenment. Simply the exotic word for happiness.
Mm.
Happiness, or another way of saying it, happiness is the common word for enlightenment.
The only thing I would add to that is it's a kind of an uncaused happiness,
Absolutely.
And I know you implied
Yes,
that,
of
Rupert,
course,
but I
yes,
just wanted
yes.
to bring that
Yes.
up. And I sort of agree when you get through all the fancy spiritual, jargon that we spiritual teachers can use. It does come down to something very, very, very simple that can somehow keep revealing itself.
It's a very interesting question to ask oneself, or for those of us that speak about these matters to people that attend our meetings. If you had a choice to be enlightened or happy, which would you go for? Well, obviously happiness.
It's an interesting conversation. I think we can distinguish between a relative and absolute happiness, a conditional and unconditional. And, we can know who we are and still have different moods, that we might consider to be unhappy, I think. So it's not about a particular experience or feeling. And in that sense, we could use the word joy or contentment. I think interchangeably with happiness, at least I would. Peace, inner peace, sense of profound well-being. I like to mix it up a little bit.
I could go with that as well. Yeah. And the interesting thing, John, I mean, we can just kind of, different ways of articulating something that we all have, and just, kind of move on from there. And that's cool. But I've also noticed when teaching, if I'm talking to somebody, sometimes different ways of articulating something will resonate. So sometimes I can just do like my thing in the way that I want to do it. But then I've noticed, like, if I'm working with a particular person, that a different languaging. So I'm just pointing out sometimes how powerful languaging can be. I think it can be very, very powerful when it's precise, and pointing people, one language that works for one person very much may not work for the next person. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's a kind of a side thing, but it's always struck me how, even though I think we're all emphasizing something beyond language and concept, but also how language and concept has a lot to do with how something can resonate for people, how it's stated, not only the concepts, but of course, the emotional tone, the feeling tone, the presence tone.
Where it comes from.
Yeah. That's the most important element.
The congruence.
I'm going to share a couple views and sort of press into it and see what your responses are. For me, I do feel that in, say, deep meditation, when separation just completely dissolves, there is a quality of peace and joy and happiness. So in that way, it feels like they're kind of synonyms in terms of words. But on the other hand, it feels like happiness in some ways is an emotional, felt sense that can arise and pass in something else, presence, consciousness, and awareness. And in that way, I don't see them as synonyms. And then further, the other view I had was that if in the near future or far future, you could stick a little electrode into my brain and produce an unending, abiding happiness, I'm not sure I would choose that. I might. I don't know. It's not available. But if I could, and there's no side effects like bad drugs, because there's something about just the love of truth. And that was my path to it. Instead of feeling unhappy at 12, I was pretty happy. And I was seized when I heard the word enlightenment. I thought, my God, whatever that is, don't know what it is. That feels of great interest. So that has another texture to it for me. So I'm wondering what your three responses are to that, those views.
Well, I can certainly say, Jonathan, as you know, having gone through some of what I've gone through with all the tremendous couple of decades of pain, and then the sort of the mind sort of, and the body's really more the body's sort of traumatic response to that, especially when the pain was gone and it didn't have to do that. And what I noticed through, I call these like really edgy experiences, right? Where you feel like you're very much on an edge. And what I noticed when I was very much on an edge and other parts of the body mind are, screaming very, very loudly. So in those edgy places, it's almost like, doing physics experiments in very unusual, high pressure situations or whatever. And I think things are discovered sometimes in these really edgy places. And what I discovered was, as the intensity level of some of the difficulty got high enough, absolutely every aspect of the experiential tone of what I would say my true nature was gone, or I couldn't experience it, or however you want to understand that. It's not, I don't think that part's that important. What was there always in every experience, no matter how terrible and no matter how blissful in retrospect, was, I think, what we all refer to, I believe, as something like awareness or consciousness, right? It was there, perceiving very, very clearly, very, very cleanly, just like it always has, even in the midst of this, uproars that were happening. But it showed me, like, at that extremity, at least for me, I don't want to say it's this way for everybody, I don't know. But for me, all those experiential, even the sort of uncaused parts of it, I didn't have any access to in those times. But what was always there without any trying or effort or anything was just sort of the same pristine clarity, right? That has no real overtone to it. And that's what survives during everything. And that kind of corresponded to my experience of investigating all this stuff, that the awareness is there, and its nature is bright and shining, and it has a sense of well-being as it flows through the body mind. But our true nature doesn't go anywhere when we're catastrophically depressed or in some other terrible state of confusion where we might not be able to get the overtone, right? We might not be, I can't feel the present sometimes when people are really in a place. But sometimes we can have access when we're not looking for even a sort of an orientating, subtle feeling tone, or maybe it's quite a overt, pleasant feeling tone, but just that clear awareness. Now, I'm glad that when you're not in all this, when the body mind isn't pulling attention, that when that's not happening, then what kind of is much more prominent in the body mind is, as Rupert was beautifully describing, just that sense of shining presence. But that's at least what, for me, what I learned, one of the things I learned in the extremity, for me, the extremity would take every piece of the experiential component. And I could see, if I wasn't careful, I might have concluded falsely that all of my true nature was missing or something like that. Fortunately, that didn't happen. There is that wonderful little clarity point. I just wanted to add that in there for whatever it's worth, because I don't know that I had seen the same thing, but boy, did I see it much, much, much more clearly when I was in this extremity, which sometimes happens, when we're in more extreme places. Yeah.
John, Rupert, any reflections on happiness being an arising within consciousness as opposed to synonymous, and also would we actually want to have unending happiness in an artificial way?
Yes, I could just say something about that, because strictly speaking, we shouldn't refer to happiness or peace as the nature of being or consciousness. We only do so by contrast with our emotions of sorrow and agitation. Because normally we think of happiness and unhappiness as two equal and alternating emotions. That's like imagining that it's like seeing a gray sky, and then the clouds part and a little bit of the blue sky shines through. And it's like imagining, oh, there's a blue cloud in the sky. That would be the equivalent of imagining that happiness is an emotion. Happiness is not an emotion. It doesn't alternate with unhappiness any more than the sky. The blue sky is not a cloud that alternates with the gray sky. It's the ever-present background that can be obscured by the gray clouds and seems as a result to be absent. That's the experience of unhappiness. And then when there's a parting of thoughts and feelings, a dissolving of thoughts and feelings, then the blue sky of happiness shines. By contrast with the old feeling of sorrow, we think, oh, happiness is a new experience. The suffering has disappeared, the new experience of happiness has come, and then our sorrow takes over again, and we think, oh, happiness has disappeared. That's putting happiness and unhappiness on the same level. They're not. And even this understanding is contained beautifully in common parlance. We speak of suffering as unhappiness. We never speak of suffering as, we never speak of happiness as unsorrow. Why? Even the word unhappiness indicates that happiness is there first. And suffering is the veiling of happiness, not the absence of suffering. Sorry, not the absence of happiness. So you might then question the validity of using the word happiness, as it's so prone to being equated with the emotion of unhappiness or suffering. And that is very legitimate. It's just that if we didn't have to speak of our true nature of being or being aware with reference to our previous experience of sorrow or agitation, we wouldn't say anything about it at all. It's not necessary to describe it. In fact, it cannot be accurately described. We only give it a provisional name in reference to our previous sorrow or agitation, and hence call it happiness or peace. So I think it's legitimate to provisionally describe it as being inherently peaceful or happy. But strictly speaking, that is only done as a compassionate concession to our previous experience of sorrow and agitation.
Thank you.
Well, beautifully said. I'll add one thing, and which is actually something I heard you say many years ago on retreat, Adya, kind of in an offhand way, but it struck me very deeply. And I know it comes from Zen. And it was, you were kind of ending a meeting and you said, enjoy yourself, even if you're not. And that really points to, I think, that apparent paradox that, prior to any affective experience, there is this, which is where.
Yeah, it's kind of a restatement of what my teacher used to say. There's the you who has no difficulty even when you're having difficulty. And I think we've all sort of touched upon that, like that the presence of being is there, whether it's you're challenged or you're not being challenged. Yeah.
And it offers, when it is uncovered, when it is recognized, it gives a context to all experience. It just, everything has a way of falling into place or harmonizing with that. And the remaining endless chapters of our book unfold much more clearly.
And I do think, notwithstanding our discussion the last 10 minutes, going back to something Rupert was bringing, that when we're pointing right at something, we have to have something to point at, right? There has to be some avenue that someone can recognize So I do think I do it myself. I do think it's absolutely legitimate to sort of point to whether it's the felt sense of presence or a well-being that's not caused because you got what you wanted. It's like inherent, and we can look and often be surprised that, wow, there isn't a well-being there, right in the midst of a challenge. And so in that sense, I think we all choose our pointers, and our pointers aren't necessarily, I think, like Rupert was saying, John, I think you're kind of sick. The pointers aren't necessarily the ultimate truth, but relatively, they're good. They're useful because, as you said, Rupert, without something to point at, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to say. So I think these avenues, I think of portals, can be really, really potent because they give someone, like, in all of the confusion that a human mind can have, it's like, here's the thing you can orient to. And we all need something to orient to. We may let go of it later, but I think something that helps us through our own experience gain access is, whether it's peace or presence or, there's lots of different tones that this stuff can show up as I see it.
Indeed. I'd like to take a sort of pause and ask one more of you to offer a brief 3 or 4 minute meditation. So Adya or Rupert can go next, sort of break up the more heady intellectual conversation. When are you willing?
Sure. Adya, I'm happy to, or happy for you to go, whichever you prefer. Jonathan, you.
I was going to yield
just
the floor, my friend, because I've been prattling on, but it doesn't matter.
I'll choose.
Why don't you choose, Jonathan?
I'll choose Rupert. Rupert,
okay.
If you're willing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just notice that the fact of simply being lies behind and intimately pervades all experience. It's not necessary to have any agenda with the content of experience, whatever that might be for each of us. Simply soften the focus of your attention on the content of experience and sink backwards, so to speak, into the fact of simply being. In everyday life, we normally emphasize the content of experience at the expense of being. In meditation or prayer, we simply soften the focus of our attention from the content of experience. We allow being to emerge, as it were, from the background of experience and shine in the foreground. And in time, we begin to notice that the content of experience loses its capacity to veil or take us away from being. And as a result, being shines not just in the background of experience, but in the midst of all experience. And as a result, the distinction between everyday life and prayer or meditation begins to dissolve. I'll leave it there.
I'm going to read a question from our participants. Sanjan writes, I have gained access to the living experience. I, awareness, am also all that appears. The experience is beyond words, and the quality is so high and pure that in order to participate in the structure of life and make it to a meeting, etc., it seems I have to lose some of that quality and spontaneity to respect time again. I have to consider a thicker degree of objectivity so I maintain engagement with structure. My question is this: in staying as awareness, knowing only awareness, does one need to sacrifice to some degree the quality of that pure, spontaneous experiencing for the sake of structured life? Is there a thicker sense of objectivity needed to maintain engagement? If yes, how thick the objectivity is and to what degree the sacrifice? Hmm. Adya, you're laughing, so I'm going to go with you.
That's quite a question.
Yeah, I like it.
Wow. It does. It's a sort of a statement of something that's quite common. People, whether it's in the realm of realization, I have this wonderful realization going, and then I go back into my life and it's difficult, or it all falls apart, or whatever. So there's all these variations, and there's sort of, I think there's two kind of approaches in a very fundamental sense. One is to sort of just have an awareness of that presence of being, right? So that's one thing. Do through activities. That's where activities really help us, when we realize that everything is part of our, if we want to use this word, practice. But also there's often a quality of insight that may be a little missing, insight into the nature of the relative world, right? That the relative world, it's hard to articulate that, because people can have a certain kind of unity experience, but not really get it, that the relative world is a manifestation of being as much as anything else is. And it's our picking and choosing and preferences that cause so much of that, get in the way of seeing that. It's a different seeing than the, like the questioner said, like the pure, wonderful expanse of being. That's true nature. Okay. What about the cart? What about the garbage can when you're going down the street, or the noise in the city, or the disturbance of who knows whatever? When we can see that, really see it as that's it too, it's amazing how much what we call the external world loses a lot of its power to disturb us, because the external, what we call the external world, is actually, if we're going to talk real non-duality and real non-separation, it's a manifestation of being. If we see that, it doesn't mean it solves all the problems of relative world and everything becomes smooth, but boy, does it provide a different platform, you might say, of entry, right? Because then we're like entering into the manifest body of being, or as we would say in Zen or Buddhism, right? That the entire universe is the body of the Buddha. So that's just a little guy in a statue, right? It's a metaphor. Yeah. So I think that's a part of it too. So those are both different approaches, right? They can happen simultaneously. But I think there's often an element of insight that can be a little more refined, that can be very helpful.
What comes to me is this is the curriculum we have as human beings, actually, is the transposition of this understanding into ordinary life. And it's a challenging one. And so, yes, we can feel these extraordinary, states, if you will, even relatively stable ones, and yet, and feel as if, as we become more active, we're engaging in a more dense or objective so-called world. But in truth, there is no object, and there is no world. This is a dualistic creation. Not that we don't navigate ordinary experience and can tell the difference between a window and a door. That obviously happens, but on a deep level of understanding, it's exactly like this is it too. And what we call the world and apparently dense objects assume a kind of transparency. It feels that they just don't have the density that we have ordinarily experienced. And I think this is what we're here to learn, actually, is the non-separateness or non-distinctiveness of form and formlessness. It's like emptiness is form, form is emptiness. And this is our the invitation.
I would just add one thing. No, I'm not really adding something. I'm perhaps just stating it in a slightly different way. That the question is really: is it possible for the actor John Smith to remain in touch with his knowledge of himself whilst fully playing the part of King Lear? And the answer is, in theory, yes, but in practice, for most, if not all people, we lose ourselves to a greater or lesser extent in our experience. But just the capacity for experience to veil or take us away from ourselves diminishes in time, so that when we do completely lose ourselves to the content of experience, it happens less and less often, and when it does happen, it lasts for less and less time. In fact, I think it was the Indian sage Atmananda Krishna Menon who was asked a similar question in slightly different words: how do I know when I'm established in my true nature? And he responded, when your experience can no longer take you away from yourself, when your thoughts, feelings, sensations, actions, relationships, and so on can no longer take you away from yourself. And as John said, using your analogy of experience becoming more and more transparent, as experience becomes more transparent, as it loses its veiling power, our being and its innate peace and quiet joy cease to be disturbed or upset or veiled by experience, and we are progressively established in that as that. But again, it's I don't think there's a final point. It's I think it's what's referred to in the Christian tradition in the idea of the transfiguration. It's the outshining of experience with the light of being or the light of awareness. And I don't think we can ever say there's a time when that outshining is complete. The light of being, the light of awareness just goes on progressively infusing and instilling our experience and finding little parts of our experience that are still have this veiling power, the power to take us away from ourselves.
And this this also points to the importance, a kind of attitude that we bring to our process of discovery, which is one of self-honesty. The willingness to actually see, areas that are continue to be veiled or obscured, and to the willingness to welcome those, to really lean in our inquiry, in our feeling, and to welcome aspects of experience that are not participating in this felt understanding. That's very important. And no one can do that for us. And that really arises from our love for truth, I think, and to be in integrity with our deepest knowing.
Julian has a question. Julian writes, we are in a climate crisis. Excuse me. We're in a climate crisis that scientists are half certain will wipe us out, or at least cause unthinkable suffering. I feel many spiritual teachers seem to be unawake as most of us are. But this huge and unwished for elephant in the room is here and now. How can spiritual teachers address this now? I would add, the International Panel for Climate Change gives us 10 or less years before irreversible damage is done. Actually, some has already been done, and cascading, tipping points occur. So I do appreciate this question. What is the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, awakening, going through those chapters, so to speak, the most skillful or appropriate response to the existential crises we are experiencing now?
Clearly not. The whole world awakening isn't going to clean up the whole world for us, nor will it even convince everybody that that's a good idea. Like any idea that awakening all ends up in the same political or otherwise perspective is just really untrue. And I think it also, Jonathan, brings up the whole notion of the value, I guess we could say, of there's this sort of intuitive line that's really important for, I think, for anybody who's doing this kind of work to really sort of find inside of themselves, between especially if they have some deeper, real, at least some sort of glimpse of true nature, and that we can have true nature. We can even utilize true nature. It's I call it the context in which all the content sort of arises and falls, and that can be very liberating and transformative. And certain amounts of the content can kind of come to rest, often just through seeing it, not attaching to it, not putting self into it, all that. And then there's parts of content that just seem to reoccur and reoccur and reoccur and reoccur. And no matter how much presence you blast at it, or letting it pass, or whatever you do, certain elements in almost everybody are going to be there. I think those are the elements then we have to go, because this is just a matter of strategy, like what works for, say, something that's reoccurring, maybe a lifetime pattern. There's also a time to kind of stop that, pull it in front of you, and really see what's going on, because it kind of, if we do that in the right way, that's a big if, we're kind of infusing awareness into our pattern, right? When we really look at something properly, it's not just, I want it through understanding or, doing something to try to get it to lessen, but what we're doing, if we're doing that correctly, we're actually bringing awareness. And awareness is really the transforming agent, I think, in so many of these issues, and not just awareness in the sense of coming back to any sort of state or experience of awareness, but sort of using that clarity of awareness to really penetrate when is necessary. It's not always necessary, but those things that are very reoccurring. And I think there's sort of a real skill that we can develop of what it's like to really sort of take that open expanse of being or awareness, and at times sort of use it almost like as a microscope. I know it's always going to still be big expanse of being, but we can simultaneously use it as this very precise instrument to go in and start to unlock some of these parts of conditioning. So what I found, some go away simply through the observation and non-attachment. Some things just kind of resolve themselves, and other things need a more really engaged way of getting more awareness, getting consciousness through whatever the modality is into specific areas, because then that area gets kind of, we wake up from the identification with those pieces. And those are the things that trip people up, what I've noticed. And so I think it's really important that we start to notice the difference between the parts of our conditioning that we see through non-attachment, letting them go, the resolve, but also going back to John, your idea of being truthful and honest, of honestly, what is reoccurring that even my realization doesn't seem to has helped it come unglued yet. What is that? And let me go right at that. like really bring the awareness in that. I think there's, to just get a sense of what approach is called for is sort of like balancing on a rope a bit, you know, like, okay, this approach is, nope, this approach is a little needed. And I think not only for teachers, but for anybody who's interested in that, we need to develop this sort of skill within ourselves so we can start to do this, make this kind of discrimination for ourselves within ourselves. I think that's quite important.
Rupert and John.
Up to you, John.
It's a big question. Coming the climate disruption, the environment, all sorts of imbalances, actually. I mean, we're living in a completely unsustainable way. We're addicted to fossil fuels. We're addicted to our tribal affiliations. We're addicted to our various beliefs, all of which impede not only a rational, but really open and response to this crisis. And I've been, engaged in sort of the environmental movement since I was 20 years old. And so I talk about it actually from time to time in public talks, in my writings. I don't make it the most important thing, but I also include it. And because it is an existential threat. And I think we all have gifts to share. And it's for us to know what those are. We all have particular issues we care about, particular, maybe applying your point, Adya, kind of finding that place where our own gifts can meet a particular need. And I know, Jonathan, this is your description of soul purpose. It's like to feel where we are called and to honor that. And sometimes that call for us is to be quiet and really deeply resourced. So we're not coming out of rage or anger, but coming out of clarity and love. And sometimes it's to really take action in a particular project or to educate people about that. We all have our role to play. And it's important to listen and honor that.
Mm-hmm.
Rupert, do you want to take a swing at that question, the efficacy, the skillfulness of spending time, as I do, dozens and dozens of, meditation retreats. And sometimes I wonder if I'm doing a meditation retreat on the deck of the Titanic, whether I shouldn't be, going to the lifeboats.
Do you think that the non-dual understanding, that is the understanding that behind the apparent multiplicity and diversity of people, animals, things, there is this single indivisible reality that everyone and everything shares, is the one understanding upon which any true civilization must be based. It's what Saint Augustine was referring to when he said, love and do whatever you want. That is, as long as you understand, but by love, he meant recognize the fact that everyone and everything shares their reality, their being. As long as that is the fundamental felt understanding on which your thoughts and feelings and subsequent actions and relationships are built, then are founded, then it doesn't really matter what you do, because whatever you do will be in one way or another an expression of that understanding. And if that understanding is not the foundation of your actions, then even if your actions do seem temporarily to help a particular local temporal issue, in time they won't contribute long term to the resolution of the problem. They will be subtly perpetuating it, because the duality, the sense of separation upon which your actions are built, will subtly in time find their way into one's actions, and therefore into the into society. So yes, I do feel that this understanding, the understanding of oneness, our inherent oneness, the unity of being, is the remedy for all society's ills. Does that mean that it's enough just to explore one's true nature and spend time on retreat? No, absolutely not. It's not. It's necessary to take that understanding out into our everyday life and live it to the best of our ability. And some people will do that in the way that the three of us do it, speaking and writing. But there are almost as many ways to express this felt understanding as there are individuals, and many people who have a very strong, feel very motivated towards the earth, nature, the environment, will express it in this way. In fact, I would suggest that the deep feeling behind movements such as Extinction Rebellion and these movements come from people's deep felt sense of oneness. They may not articulate it the way we do here, using the language that we do here, but the motive behind those movements is the felt sense of oneness. The motive behind Black Lives Matter, it's the same thing. It's this deep felt sense of oneness that everybody feels to a greater or lesser extent, although they may not articulate it the way we do here. So yes, I do feel this understanding is the understanding that is necessary for any true civilization. But no, it's not enough just to so-called have this understanding, to think it and feel it. It's necessary to take it out into the world, and in relation to climate change, to go out into the world and to make a very, very definite contribution.
Well, of course, I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I want to point out another part where I think I differ, which is that it seems to me there are cases and exemplars of people who there's some consensus. I'm thinking of Yasutani Roshi. He figured highly in when I was young, because he was in the 3 pillars of Zen, and he was a Zen master, or so they said. And it turns out that during World War II, he was very strongly in favor of Imperial Japan's ambitions. He wrote anti-Semitic screeds, which was baffling to me since there's not many Jews in Japan. But when I read his writings on Zen, they seemed like the real deal. So if, in fact, he had a deep awakening, it seems a la kind of Ken Wilber, this idea that there are different lines of development, that there was a kind of a traditional, his ego is fixed at a sort of traditional, loyal level to the emperor and so forth. And there was this awakening. If that is the case, it would seem to me that this awakening is necessary, as you've said, but maybe not sufficient. That there has to be some sort of ego maturing, not just a kind of a softening. Does that make sense? How do you hold that possibility of someone of the stature of Yasutani Roshi, but at the same time being quite, instead of it sort of aiding life, it seems to actually do, some of the opposite.
This is, you're referring also to the book Zen at War by Brian Victoria. And there are a number of cases, actually, of Zen masters. And you'll find it among Hindu sadhus and gurus, pro-nationalist. And so this is the tribal affiliation I was alluding to before. We have tribal, we have racial, we have economic affiliations, we have our privileges, there's just all sorts of layers of identity that often are not touched, and not really deeply looked at. And so it's very sobering, I think, to recognize the truth of this. and for me, it's like all hands on deck. It's like, yes, go as deeply as you can in terms of the recognition of true nature, and use your capacity of reason, inform yourself. Even don't wait until some kind of pure realization before you take action. I think this element of maturity, I would agree. Ethical maturity, aesthetic maturity, these are complementary lines of development, and we can be very developed in terms of our so-called spiritual insight, and rather immature in these others. And so I think it's important to recognize that within ourselves and socially, and not be naive about this, and see the importance of that, of recognizing immaturity and immature and undeveloped aspects in ourself and in our own societies.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. I do want to move to the next question, but in case Rupert or Adi, you want to add a little something to that, feel free to. Nope.
That was just beautiful.
Okay. All right, this question comes from Josh Leonard. It's on evolution. If we acknowledge that absolute consciousness itself doesn't evolve, but that seemingly everything in the relative world, including mind, body, culture, and society, do evolve, what then are the spiritual implications of evolution? What responsibility do spiritual leaders have to actively participate in the evolution of culture and society?
That's all?
That's it. I picked the really light questions.
Yeah.
Let's go with Rupert, then John, then Adya.
I think a so-called spiritual teacher has a not just a spiritual teacher, anyone who's interested in these matters. I don't really make distinctions between so-called spiritual teachers and spiritual students. So a spiritual teacher is just a good spiritual student. So any of us interested in these matters, yes, we have a loving obligation to live this understanding to the best of our ability, to express it in our lives, to examine those parts of our lives that are yet to be aligned with it. Does that mean that such a person has an obligation to go out and actively participate in and contribute to society and culture? And no, I don't think so necessarily. Some may be inclined to do so, but others not. And I don't think those that seem not to go out into culture and into society, helping in an active way, I don't think they're actually contributing any less to our society. Eckhart Tolle has a very nice phrase for them. He calls them the frequency holders. It's a beautiful phrase. The people who just tend to stay home and abide in being, hold the frequency, so to speak, may not go out into the world and contribute overtly in a recognizable way to society or culture, but they contribute something, I think, equally valuable, but not so noticeable. Mm-hmm. So I think, yes, there is we all have a loving duty, all of us. As I say, I make no distinctions between so-called teachers and so-called students. Anyone who's interested in these matters has a loving obligation to live the implications of this understanding to the best of our ability, and to continually realign all aspects of ourselves with this understanding more and more deeply. But that will express itself in very different ways in different people, some very actively, some less actively. But I think each contribute to society in the same way, although some may appear not to have any active role, or that they may have less active participation in society and culture, but I don't think they contribute any less to our society.
John, Adya?
The contemplatives.
I agree, and it's nice to introduce the metaphor or description of frequency, because I do think as there is a lessening of the veils, as there is as the background light of awareness shines through ever more brightly, there's an upleveling of frequency, and that radiates spontaneously out, and is beneficent. And so if we are wired to be a contemplative, then we are, I think it's important to honor that. One point I would kind of like to accent here, which I find very interesting, is I think as the ego is attenuated and seen through, and as that shift from background to foreground happens increasingly, knowing ourselves as the context rather than the content of awareness, as we know ourselves, as we're free, as recognizing ourselves as no one fundamentally, we're actually freed to be our unique self. We're actually free to be someone, and that's actually potentiated in very important ways, because we're not concerned about outcomes. We're not concerned about how it looks. We're concerned about being true to a spontaneous and creative movement. And that can take, and I'm just kind of elaborating on what you're saying, Rupert, can take many different forms, and could be, and different phases as well. So it could look like leadership, outspoken leadership and advocacy, or it could be very, very quiet. And I think it's that potentiality is liberated the freer we are from our self-story and our self-image.
Well, I'd agree with both of you, so we'll see if there's much more to say. I don't really want to repeat what you've both said, because I really feel there's a truth in that. So I'm going to take a little bit different tact, just for that reason. I do think we have to, keep in touch, deep touch with the human heart, right? Because that's where our vision, our big vision, becomes human, and I think almost like relativized, right? So we can take this realization of being and bring it into what we do. Now, the difference is, and both of you have sort of suggested, and I think this is a really important point, that the goal here isn't to become the idealized version of whatever we think we should be. It's just to become what we authentically are, not only in pure being, which of course is the prime realization, but also as a human being. John was suggesting this, I think, to find out, but without creating an image that we think we have to be. So we are actually discovering our place in the world. We're discovering the deeper impulse, not the human impulse. It's almost like even though one could take this too concretely, I often think of it as like let's say I'm moving into this so-called retirement thing, right? But I'm not going to sit around for the rest of my life and watch TV or something, right? I know that at some point life will find me. It's the way it's always worked. It's kind of it'll find a direction. It will present it. I don't need to come up with a idealized version of what that might be. So there's ways I think that life is finding everybody, their sort of unique way of being. And that's a really interesting part of realization that I found, because often, not always, there's some very sort of meek, in the best sense of the world, very quiet realizers. And there's also realizers with big personalities, right? Jesus, big, 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 big personality. That's not to say an ego, but big, and oftentimes that energy of pure being, because it releases us from so much fear and our neurosis and our hesitation to be who and what we really are, that it does fill the human being with a certain kind of confidence, well-being, in which we can kind of find the way, or let life present what our path is, what our way of being is. And perhaps that will be as a climate crusader. Of course, Jonathan, I'm an absolute lover of nature. I'm running out my front door every chance I get and heading up as high as I can get in the mountains. That's not necessarily helping the environment. But I think we all need to be really true to our calling, what that calling is. Of course, the environment is a profound and big, big, big challenge. And I do have some reservations of what I sometimes hear, like in the spiritual world, these movements of, okay, now we're all in the oneness new movement, or whatever it is. It could be anything. And this is going to change. And there'll often be a list of things. This is going to revolutionize society. And often I'm sitting there going like, really? Is that what it's going to do? I think the people that need to be fed actually need to be fed. I think these problems that this is just supposed to spontaneously, resolve in some sort of spiritual fantasy. That's the only way where I kind of come to a place and go, we can get really, really hyper sort of idealized. And that's a very sort of egocentric pursuit, masquerading in spiritual clothing. But we can, I think, go under that, a deep listening, find our true nature, and also find that way in which true nature and our humanity converge and have direction, whatever that direction is. And I think we are all at our most powerful, most creative, most energetic, most inspired when we are really honing in on, again, like what life is presenting for us, not so much what I want to be and what I want to do. That makes sense.
Beautifully said. I want to follow up this question of life direction, but I see we have less than 15 minutes left. I want to check in with each of you, no pressure. Is it possible that the three of you could stay 15 minutes later than we had planned? If not, no worries. One yes.
Fine with me.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, very good. All right. Then let's go to that. So it's a two-part question for all of you. And I think, Adu, you answered it somewhat already. Does a human being have, alternately known as, a calling, a destiny, a life purpose, a soul level direction, if you will? And second part, if you subscribe to some version of that, what is an efficient way for a person to discern, to receive, to have that revealed in their lives, so they feel like, oh, yes, I feel the meaning that is bespoke to me? John, Rupert?
I believe there is. And I was actually going to follow up a little bit with what you were saying, Adya, because I think we're talking about an archetypal level that gets energized when the egoic level subsides. And that is to say, there are greater forces in nature and in the psyche than we're normally aware of. And they constellate in different ways through different individuals and express themselves perhaps as a teacher or a nurturer or a leader, caregiver, whatever it may be, divine mother. And so they have a particular potency, particularly when we don't identify with them and become inflated, right? And find ourselves, taken on a mission, So that's very important, to not identify with that, but actually to be aware of it and allow that movement through us, allow ourselves to be moved. how to recognize that. Well, this is kind of your specialty, Jonathan. So I think, you know, your insights would be very relevant here. It comes unexpected and unbidden when I think there is a sense of profound availability and openness. And that quality of availability and openness can be accented particular times in our life, perhaps by a crisis, perhaps by a retreat, when we've really set aside time and have the intention to go deeply. And it can happen at any moment. And in a way, it is a moment-to-moment inquiry. Like, what's a true movement now? What feels genuine? What feels in alignment with something very deep and profound? So there are, you know, I'm sure, particular methods and methodologies for facilitating that inquiry. I think it's good to know that what we might metaphorically call a soul level does exist. It's often not acknowledged in non-dual teaching. Somewhere between the ego and universal consciousness is this unique signature, some that we each have, and has an archetypal feel to it. Knowing about that, I think, is important. Being open to it is another, and being able to relinquish our own egocentric attachment and identification with that is very important as well.
Rupert.
I don't think I have anything to add to that at the moment.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I want to put forth just a touch of my own understanding and have you correct it, agree with it, say no way. You know, following. So some of you, or maybe all of you, are familiar with, you know, Jung and Hillman and Sufism and Corban. And to me, there is a between our everyday, you know, lives and unbounded consciousness, this imaginal world, is the way Corban put it. And by accessing that dimension of ourselves, we can come to discover, to have it be revealed, you know, a sense of calling or purpose or destiny. And there's a quote from Friedrich Buechner that I use all the time that really lights me up. And it says something to the effect of, find the place where your deep gladness, your deep joy, and the world's hunger meets. And Jung said that we're animated by like a unique myth, a mythopoetic story. And that isn't usually talked about in non-duality, as you said, John. So I'm wondering, is that something that we should bring back? That's maybe it's latent in non-dual teachings, or does it feel like, oh no, that's another level of story. We need another story, like we need a hole in the head. So at that level of unique myth, destiny, a feeling of a revelation of purpose, does this belong in the non-dual discussion?
I think it absolutely belongs in the discussion, because, as you said, it does seem that each part of this journey is waking up from our over-identification with our stuff, our humanity. And strangely, it's also about liberating that humanity to find its way, right? To find something that's feels very, very authentic and very, very real, and right. And I think there's lots of different ways to talk about that. I agree, sort of that imaginal realm comes in kind of handy, right? It helps one to kind of access, because that's the zone, like as you said, between pure being and our human being, as it's defined sort of through ego, let's say. There's this other thing, though, isn't there? It seems to me, by whatever we call that. And I think that's in Zen, one way they would articulate is the true man. It could be the true person with no rank. No rank meaning no place in society that they're concerned with, right? But the true person, I think that's an interesting inquiry. There's who am I? What's the essential being? And actually, what's the true person? And I don't think You know, there's a time when I wouldn't mix all those up because it would just be too confusing initially. But there's, I think, a time when it's totally relevant and even necessary, where we bring in these elements of pure being and true human being. And that's a kind of it's a very related, but not an absolute line of development, right? We can be fairly quite awake without the human part really being getting the what we've been calling it, you know, embodiment, right? Yeah.
I'll call that the sort of the second inquiry, and let me know what you think.
Mhm.
Is, you know, Ramana Maharshi's Atma Vichara, that, you know, who am I, right? Self-inquiry, self-abidance. But it's, to me, it's not just who or what am I, it's also what am I called to? What do I belong to? Or the way I say it is, what is my purpose? And I think the two questions together, like two wings of the bird, that one without the other, and perhaps, you know, the purpose one in calling is really embedded, one could say, and I would be fine with that. But I think it's important to explicate it, to actually say it out loud, because one could think, oh, the accent is on being, not realizing that, of course, being is has a dynamism, a dance, a becomingness to it.
Yeah. As we say in Zen, it's not doing nothing, it's doing nothing. Right? Or it's not just being nothing, it's being nothing. Just that little change of emphasis experientially can light up a whole lot of energy in us. Right? Keep us, as we say in Zen, from getting stuck in emptiness, stuck in the transcendent, and it's not really, for some reason, it's not really connecting with the human being. So this whole thing we're talking about is quite ancient and quite well known, I think, in contemplative circles. Not that it's been resolved necessarily in them, but it's been known for a long time.
Yeah.
I'll make one note here, which is interesting, Aju, because as you speak, you're gesturing from the heart, right? When you speak of this, and this is my experience from where this originates, not on outer levels, you know, but a very, very, very deep level in the heart area, kind of just on that edge, you know, between universal and individual. So to speak of the real person or the real individual, I think is close to naming what this is. And it's also very important in terms of intimacy. In other words, it's very easy to skip over this, you know, and just go to the big space and go to the universal and feel, you know, that kind of oneness. What I say, it's easy, maybe not so easy, but it is accessible and available. But to actually not skip over this, you know, but actually slow down in this subtle intermediary level and give it its right place is an important part of the flowering, both individually and collectively, of humanity. So in my work, you know, either group retreat work or one-on-one work, from time to time, quite spontaneously, this dimension unfolds, and it has such a beautiful quality of intimacy. And when we relate to one another in this way, not just as pure being and not, you know, as egoic individuals, but with this quality of intimacy, it's extraordinarily touching and beautiful. True friendship, I think, and true lovers meet in this way.
I'm glad you brought that up, John, because I do think that heartful aspect, it's, at least for me, was almost like falling in love with the world, right? Which is a little bit, we fall in love with the world when we see the non-separation, but at least for me, there was also then later, there was a bit more humanized version of the same thing, if that makes any sense. And that made a difference because it brought into that real intimacy, right? Intimacy and to the point of not separation, but that I'm glad you brought in that element, because I think it's a good bridge between those two dimensions of being, you know?
We have 17 minutes left, since we're going to go a little over. And I have plenty more questions. I want to ask you, do you have any questions for each other? Some challenge or some, I would like to know this, Adya, I'd like to know this, Rupert. And if you don't, I'll let my questions rip, but I'll just leave the space open for a moment.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Adya.
Hmm.
How are you going to spend your time when you're no longer speaking and writing? What are you going to do in your retirement?
First of all, I'm not entirely sure, but I
Okay.
will probably do what I'm doing now. I'm not teaching a lot now, and I love the outdoors. I frequently go on 3 to 6 hour runs in the mountains, and I'm living on, since I was a child, the Sierra Nevada mountains were my sacred place. This was my cathedral. So I'm kind of living on my personal version of Anarachala, being in these mountains. And I've noticed in 3 years, it's a very place can be, it's not essential, but place can be so important. And I think it's also, quite honestly, played a little bit, not in a very small way, because my retirement is not about this necessarily, but it might have played some small part, because I find as I'm immersed in this environment and immersing myself in my sacred mountains, that my instinct hasn't been on display today, by the way, but my instinct or my desire or whatever we'd call that to articulate my experience, I notice the more time I'm immersing myself, the more that desire is just sort of disappearing.
Yes.
And so that's also like, okay, that's, and that's fine. I really, really enjoy that too. But, so I don't know if that.
Yes, and can I ask you another question about your
Sure.
decision to so-called retire?
Yeah.
Did it did it come out of a feeling, and this is sort of informed by something that happened to me when I was working as an artist, and an intuition I have about myself. Was it just a feeling that your work, speaking and writing about these matters, it was accomplished? You felt that it was, or was it a more more calculated decision? What's behind my question is that when I was working as an artist or a potter for 30 years, there came a time when I just felt that I had made everything, I had said everything that I could say. There was I had stretched the medium to its limit, and it just, there was the impulse that had always been there in the past to push beyond limits, to stretch the material further. It just came to an end. I felt that it was just, my work was just finished there, and I had an intuition that probably that one day it will be the same with writing and speaking about these matters, that I'll just, that there'll be less and less and less words, and I just think I've done all I can do.
Yeah.
So the question was, was there just this feeling of it's accomplished now, or was it
You
some
know,
more
Rupert,
rational?
I appreciate the question. I also appreciate your recounting your experience, because it's remarkable how your experience with art reflects my experience with teaching. Now, of course, there was this whole other background, you know, of all the years of pain and all that kind of stuff and the effects that had. And I even tried to communicate this when I was writing a little letter about this to the Sangha. And so you can give reasons. People like reasons and they're relevant. But underneath all that, and the most primary thing was, it was remarkable sitting here listening to you, to just recounting in your brief way that you did your relationship with your art, because that was what was under it. It's been, for me personally, notwithstanding how other people might feel about it, for me, it was literally, the words just came, it's done.
Yes.
And what that meant was what you already described. It had all those sort of elements. It's just done. It's been very simple, very clean. I felt it coming for maybe 3 years, but I always kind of wait, right? Till I found timing's really important. I didn't calculate the timing. I just waited until it was totally clear. So for me, it's almost, it's wonderful, but it's almost a little eerie how simple the whole thing has been for me. Just, yeah, it's done. At least the public, I may do some writing and stuff like that, a more contemplative sort of, yeah. So, yeah, remarkably simple for me, the decision.
Any last question or two to each other?
I don't have a question. I have a feeling of gratitude to be together.
I'm really glad we did this while I'm still around to do it, because I also wanted to meet you, Rupert, for many, many years. And so, yeah, it's just been a delight. And it feels like something, this is just for me, but it's something about it feels appropriate for me to be here with you, for us to be doing this in the last 4 weeks that I'll be teaching. This just feels like, yes, just the yesness, right? Here we are. It just feels a really nice bookend for me from the beginning to now. Yeah.
And for me, I'm friends with each of you. We each have our individual friendships, but we haven't met in this forum before, and I appreciate sort of doing so.
And I hope when I did this, I usually, honestly, I think I might even told Jonathan this. I said, Jonathan, this is the kind of thing that I generally avoid like the plague.
You did say that.
Yeah, that's me. That's not like anybody else. But the reason I wanted to do it, number one, I wanted to be with you. That's all of you. That's the primary reason. But also, I do think there is some usefulness in, even though there is so much similarity through the three of us, there's also little distinctions. And I think those distinctions are important for each person's teaching. And I think I was hoping that if people could hear this, they could get a sense that while there can be a lot of agreement, part of the beauty of each person's, I won't even say teachers, was anything or anybody can be a teacher, but each being's way of being is kind of a little bit unique. And that uniqueness among people that do what we do is important to have that uniqueness, but at the same time unfolding, like we just have a little bit different ways of talking about the same thing, at least with the three of us. That's not always the case, but so I really am grateful you brought us together and that we finally got it together. It's not easy corralling 3 teachers.
Well, I flaked on you twice, so
one of my
necessarily so.
One of my deep reasons for doing this was an experience I had when I was 16. I prayed for a teacher, and Ramana Maharshi came to me through a book, and he made such an impact, just seared himself into my mind. But I made there was a massive misperception which lasted over a decade. I was like, that is what a sage is. That's what enlightenment looks like. And of course, there was zero chance I was going to become a one loincloth type of guy sitting at a mountain writing love poetry to a mountain. And I just was like, oh, I can't. And then eventually, finally, I was like, wait a minute, that was his expression, more like a classical Indian sage. That's not my dharma. That's not my purpose. And so the reason I do continue to study with all 3 of you is that it is a little bit different. The way you live your lives, your personalities, your teachings, the little subtle dimensions and so forth. And just to have it all together on one screen, as it were, I thought might be beneficial to other folks, so they don't make that mistake I did for as long as I made it. So yeah.
And probably, I won't speak for everybody for sure, but many of us, probably most of us in spirituality, make a very similar mistake. We get an image, we think that's the image, rather than that's the unique way that being showed up there. Isn't that great? I think it's just, most of us do that at some point, I think, Jonathan, and hopefully we get beyond that, where we see that, well, being is showing up pretty much everywhere we look.
Yeah.
Pretty diverse.
Yeah. Well, I want to end with a speed round. Here we go. 3 of your favorite or just teachers that you like who are no longer living. Just teachers you recommend or have moved you. John.
Jean Klein, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Ramana Maharshi.
Rupert.
Meister Eckhart, Anandamaya Ma, and Balayani.
I would say Meister Eckhart, very profound, Nisargadatta, and Bonki, an old iconoclast Zen master. Yeah.
3 teachers who are living, who you feel some affinity, some respect, some admiration for. John.
Adya, Rupert, and who else? Byron Katie.
Rupert.
Adya, John, and my companion.
Adya.
I'm, as you probably know, Jonathan, I'm actually, for a spiritual teacher, I'm very disconnected from the world of spiritual teachers, actually. So that's hard for me to come up, but I can tell you the greatest teacher in the last 30 years of my life, who's living, is my wife, Mukti. I've learned more from her and being with her, and there's been more of that remaining ego diminishment and a million other things by just, I think, being in a clear-sighted relationship is amazing spiritual practice. And for me, I mean this very literally, she calls me my teacher, but I'm her she calls herself my student, but she's actually my teacher. Yeah. It's nice the way things can just flip back and forth.
Yeah, she's extraordinary. All right, last speed round question. 3 books. And one has to be in the last 20 years. Something current. And they could all be current. John.
Sermons by Meister Eckhart. The Red Book by Carl Jung. And that's what comes to mind. I Am That is outside of your perimeter here, but that would be my 3rd.
Rupert.
The Unity of Being by Meister Eckhart. The Ashtavakra Gita. Brother Lawrence, The Practice of the Presence of God.
Adya.
I Am That, of course, would have to be in there. I think it's called The Unborn. It's a book about Bonki, which I've just loved, and it's great for people that are kind of used to non-duality. It's a different language, but it's a wonderful way, wonderful articulation of it. And then The last thing, because my big problem, as you know, Jonathan, we share a rather deficient memory, let's say, so remembering things. But the thing that really stood out above all these was, I can't remember the exact name of the sermon, but a Meister Eckhart sermon on spiritual poverty was
Number 22.
Thank you, John. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. Yeah. And actually, I was introduced to it by a Buddhist abbess, a woman who ran a Buddhist monastery, and she called it the best piece of Buddhism she'd ever read.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for indulging me in the speed round.
Mm-hmm.
I'll offer a few announcements and then a closing. First is that there will be a roundtable participant conversation if you'd like to come. And it will be in 6 days on Friday, September 29th. It'll just be me, not these folks won't be coming unless they want to. And it's a chance for us to actually dig into the questions and your own answers and moving with those. So it's not just a listening, but it's an exploring. It's a becoming intimate with the question by speaking out loud and exploring together. So I'll send you something about that. About 1 in 10 participants have made a donation, and I want to say thank you very much. And I do want to ask that the other 9 consider if you're able to make a donation. If you're not, just please, no paywall event means everybody is included. But if you can make a donation, it enables PGI to continue to do these just sign up, no paywall events. And then the last thing is there is a series called Portals to Awakening, which starts a week tomorrow on Sunday, October 1st, every 2 weeks. And the first one will be Ramana Maharshi's Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, self-abidance. And then every 2 weeks, we'll do, the next one is I Am meditation, Nisargadatta Maharaj. The next one is pointing out instructions. The next one is Headless Way. Then incubation meditation, which comes from an ancient Greek tradition via Peter Kingsley. And then finally, Byron Katie's inquiry. From the bottom of my heart, first of all, thank you for being my teachers or spiritual students who are willing to share some of the fruits, some of your experience along the way. It has been incalculably beneficial to me. I prayed my butt off when I was young. Please send me a teacher. Please send me a teacher. And it was dry, just dry. Nothing was happening. And then it started trickling and then raining. And I am so grateful. Words cannot express my gratitude to you, John, to you, Adya, and to you, Rupert. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And thank you to everybody who participated, even just with your energy, sitting around the round table with us, listening, adding your, I see the many questions there and the side that I wasn't able to get to. I love that you're involved, and I hope to see you at another event. So with that, blessings for the rest of your day and weekend. Bye-bye, everybody.